Imagine you are lying somewhere warm and quiet, perhaps with the softest of lantern light glowing nearby, and the faint rustle of leaves outside your window, a gentle night breeze passing through. Tonight, we will wander very far away, across both oceans and centuries, and step softly into a place that few of us will ever truly know. The hidden and delicate world of concubines in ancient China. This is not a story of court intrigue or sudden drama. No, tonight, we will simply drift through their days, as though we were quiet guests in a distant palace, watching time pass in slow motion, listening to the sound of flowing water in the gardens, smelling faint sandalwood drifting in the air. Imagine a world where dawn arrives not with alarms or rushing, but with the soft thud of a servant's footsteps on polished wooden floors, and the distant chime of a bell announcing that morning has begun. The concubines of an imperial court, or even of a wealthy household, would slowly rise from their carved beds, the mosquito nets still swaying softly, and begin the gentle routines of their mornings. There was no hurry. Time seemed to stretch wide, because every hour was carefully ordered, and everything they did was shaped by tradition and quiet expectation. Their rooms were painted with soft colors, sometimes pale jade or cool blues, and the furniture was spare but elegant, meant to soothe the mind and encourage contemplation. Outside, there might be the sound of water dripping into a basin, the chirp of a bird greeting the early sun. In this calm setting, they would begin with the simplest acts, washing the face and hands with water that had been warmed just enough, combing their hair with wooden combs rubbed with a touch of oil so it shone like dark silk, and sometimes applying a very light powder to keep the skin pale, which was considered beautiful. There was always an emphasis on quiet grace, each motion measured and gentle, each step in the room light, as if walking across clouds. Breakfast would be brought on low trays, perhaps a bowl of congee, fragrant with a few dried goji berries or sweet dates, maybe a delicate tea steeped just for them. Eating was never rushed. The morning air might be filled with the faint tapping of bamboo as gardeners swept the pathways outside, or the far-off sound of court musicians beginning their practice. After breakfast, the day's rhythm would unfold slowly. A concubine's life was filled with waiting not in boredom, but in a sort of meditative patience. Some spent their time reading poetry, tracing the delicate calligraphy on silk scrolls, repeating the verses softly to themselves. Others painted with brushes so fine that each stroke felt like a tiny prayer, capturing plum blossoms or bamboo leaves on paper. Some practiced music, plucking gently at the strings of a guqin, the notes lingering like drops of water falling into a pond. Each day was not entirely their own, but they found small ways to make it beautiful. Imagine a sunbeam crossing the floor, moving so slowly you could watch it inch toward a screen, the dust motes dancing inside it. The concubines might sit together and embroider, their needles flashing quietly in the light, creating endless peonies and cranes on silk. Conversation was soft, never hurried, often filled with stories of their families or small gossip from the court. Outside their chambers, the palace itself was alive in a slow, breathing way. Servants moving in patterns like the flow of water, carrying tea, arranging flowers, feeding the koi in the ponds. Occasionally, there might be lessons or practices in etiquette, where they learned to bow in just the right way, to walk with exactly the right posture, to hold a fan so that it was both modest and graceful. Some were called to study philosophy or history, so that they might speak with refinement if ever they were summoned to spend time with the emperor. These lessons, too, were quiet and deliberate, often taught by older women who had seen many seasons pass and whose voices were low and even. The afternoons would stretch on with a kind of warm stillness. If it was summer, they might move to a shaded pavilion near a pond, listening to the slow drone of cicadas and fanning themselves gently. If it was winter, they would sit by small braziers filled with glowing charcoal, warming their hands and sipping tea. Their clothing was layered, soft silks in pale colors, and even the act of arranging the folds of their robes was considered part of a cultivated life. Sometimes the day would bring a summons perhaps to attend a banquet, or to join the emperor for an evening gathering, and in those hours there was preparation, hair dressed elaborately, pins of jade or gold carefully placed, robes chosen for their meaning and beauty. But even this preparation was not frantic. It was ceremonial, like a kind of living artwork. At night, when lanterns were lit, the palace would glow softly. Shadows would stretch across the floor, and the sound of footsteps would be muffled. Some concubines would spend the evening writing letters or poetry by lamplight, their brush gliding slowly over the paper. Others would sit quietly and gaze at the moon, which was a favorite pastime in ancient China. Moon-gazing was considered a kind of meditation, watching its silver light touch the trees, the ponds, the tiled rooftops. As the night deepened, everything grew slower and softer. The air might carry the scent of flowers that only opened after dark. Somewhere far away, a night watchman might strike a wooden clapper to mark the hours. Eventually, they would return to their beds, draw the curtains closed, and lie very still, hearing nothing but the sound of their own breathing, and perhaps a distant breeze. In this world, life was not loud or rushed, but a long series of gentle moments, woven together into something like a quiet dream. And so, tonight, as you listen, you might imagine yourself there, walking softly along the palace corridors, your footsteps silent, breathing in the faint smell of incense, feeling the coolness of the smooth stone floor. You might sit with them under the moonlight, listening to the Guqin, feeling time slow until you too are ready to rest. Now that we have gently passed through a day in the quiet company of the palace women, let us drift even deeper into their world and see what else their lives were made of. Beyond the soft rhythm of mornings and evenings, the concubines lived within a web of rituals that shaped how they moved, spoke, even how they thought. Life in the palace was a balance between waiting and preparing, between the inner self and the outer world, and each moment carried meaning. Imagine the soft echo of footsteps along stone corridors that have been polished by centuries of walking, the sound blending with the faint dripping of water from carved dragon-headed spouts into courtyards where lotuses floated. The concubines were often taught to cultivate not only their beauty but their minds, for this was considered a way to please heaven as well as the emperor. They would spend hours practicing calligraphy, the brush held just so, the ink dark and fragrant. With each stroke, they were not merely writing words, but shaping their inner character, an idea deeply rooted in Confucian thought. The rooms where they wrote were quiet, with perhaps a single stick of incense burning in a bronze holder, the smoke curling like a slow ribbon toward the ceiling. Imagine the faint smell of sandalwood or agar wood, soothing and grounding, mixing with the sound of the brush on paper. Outside the windows, a pine tree might sway, its needles whispering. Some concubines were trained in music, and they would spend long hours learning to play instruments like the pipa, the guqin, or the flute. The notes were soft, lingering in the air, meant not to excite, but to calm the heart. In this world, art was never separate from life. It was a way to live beautifully. There were lessons in poetry, too, where they would memorize the classics and recite them together, their voices rising and falling gently. Poetry was a way to express what could not be said directly: longing, joy, even quiet sorrow. A favorite pastime was writing poems on fans or on slips of silk, exchanging them like secret messages. When a festival approached, the atmosphere changed slightly, but still with a soft kind of energy. There were the lantern festival nights, where the palace would glow with countless small lights, each lantern painted with flowers, birds, or mythical creatures. The concubines would walk among them slowly, some holding hands with their closest companions, their laughter barely more than a whisper, the lantern light touching their faces. On other occasions, they might prepare offerings to the moon during Mid-Autumn Festival, setting out fruits and sweet cakes on low tables, then sitting together to watch the moon rise. In those moments, they were not only concubines but simply women, sharing in an ancient tradition that connected them to everyone outside the palace walls who looked up at the same moon. There were seasonal changes too, and these shaped their days. In spring, the palace gardens filled with new blossoms, and they might go out to gather flowers or simply to admire them, writing verses about plum blossoms brave enough to bloom in the cold, or about peach flowers dancing in the breeze. In summer, they would retreat to cooler halls, where servants hung reed screens soaked with water to cool the air. In autumn, the air would be crisp, and they would wear slightly heavier silks, embroidered with motifs of chrysanthemums and cranes. And in winter, they would sit closer to the braziers, wrapping themselves in thick robes, watching the snow fall silently beyond the latticed windows. Even meals followed the season's lighter fare in summer, warming soups and dumplings in winter. Food itself could be an art. Imagine trays of tiny dishes, each one carefully prepared, perhaps slices of pear carved into the shape of flowers, rice arranged in perfect domes, vegetables glistening as if painted. There was an unhurried elegance in the way they ate, small bites taken slowly, tea poured in graceful arcs from high-spouted pots. Sometimes special sweets or fruits would be sent from distant provinces, and tasting them was like tasting a piece of the empire itself. Yet for all this beauty, their lives were also full of waiting to be summoned, waiting for news, waiting for the turning of the seasons. And in this waiting, they developed a kind of quiet endurance. They learned to read subtle signs, to understand the moods of the court, to listen carefully to what was not said. Their friendships with one another became important. In the stillness of long afternoons, they would talk softly, sharing their thoughts, their memories of home, even their dreams. Some friendships were lifelong, forged in this shared stillness. Others were more delicate, like the petals of the flowers they embroidered, fading quickly. But each had its place in the tapestry of palace life. And so, as we sit here imagining them, we can see how their lives were not only about luxury or privilege, but about learning to live gracefully in a world where they were not entirely free. Perhaps that is why their days were so carefully ordered, their movements so calm, because in this order, they found a kind of peace. Tonight, as you listen, you might imagine sitting with them under the lantern light, feeling the warmth of tea between your hands, hearing the faint music of a gukin somewhere nearby. The air is cool, but not cold, and above you the moon hangs like a silver coin. The world is quiet, the palace sleeping, and you feel yourself becoming quieter too, as though you are breathing in rhythm with the night itself. In this slow, gentle world, there is no rush to wake, no need to think about tomorrow. There is only this moment, this quiet companionship, this shared sense of time stretching softly like silk. As the palace grows quieter and the moon rises higher, we might imagine what the concubines did in their most private hours, those moments when there was no lesson to attend, no festival to prepare for, no summons to wait for. These were the hours of truly slow time, when the night felt as if it might last forever. After dinner, when the lamps were lit and the corridors grew shadowy, many concubines turned to small, soothing pastimes. They might sit at low tables with sets of painted playing cards or small carved game pieces, playing zainkhi, Chinese chess, or a simple game of pitch, pot, where they would toss arrows into a narrow, necked vessel. The sound of the arrows landing a faint wooden click might echo softly through the hall. Laughter, if there was any, was gentle, like wind rustling through silk. Sometimes they would tell stories to each other, sitting in a loose circle, their robes arranged like flower petals around them. The stories might be old folk tales, or retellings of famous poems, or even gentle gossip about someone they had seen in the gardens. The air would be filled with the smell of warm oil from the lamps, and the faint sweetness of osmanthus wine that might be sipped in tiny cups. Grooming rituals, too, were an important part of these quiet hours. Hair was carefully let down, brushed until it shone, oiled lightly with fragrant essences. Nails were trimmed and polished, skin rubbed with herbal balms to keep it soft through the dry winter months. These small acts of care were done slowly, almost ceremonially, and could last as long as an hour. The concubines might help one another, combing each other's hair or arranging the pins and ornaments so they would not tangle overnight. This was also the time for private letters. If they had family outside the palace, they would write by lamplight, the brush gliding silently over the paper. Because the palace was a place of great caution, every word had to be chosen carefully. Sometimes the letters were never sent, simply folded and kept as a way to feel close to home. The night could be very still, the silence broken only by the sound of a distant night watchman tapping his clappers to mark the hour. In those moments, some concubines would simply sit by the window, gazing out at the moonlit courtyard. The moon was a companion to them, a silent listener to their thoughts. They believed that looking at the moon connected them to their loved ones far away, for they would see the same moon no matter where they were. Others would take up a brush and paint, quietly perhaps a plum blossom branch, or the silhouette of a lone crane's small scenes that captured their mood. In summer, they might sleep with the windows open, listening to crickets, feeling the warm air stir the silk curtains. In winter, they might curl under thick quilts, breathing in the faint scent of cedar or chrysanthemum sewn into the bedclothes. Sometimes dreams were shared in the morning, discussed softly as though they held hidden meanings. Dreams were considered omens, and an unusual dream might be written down and kept. And so, these private hours, though quiet, were rich in texture, filled with soft sounds, faint smells, slow gestures. Imagine sitting with them in this stillness, the flicker of the oil lamp painting gold shadows on the wall, the sound of a brush against paper, the touch of cool night air on your skin. You might hear a faint rustle of silk as someone shifts on a cushion, or the distant hoot of an owl. You might feel the palace breathing around you, ancient and patient. It is in these moments, when nothing seems to happen, that the deep peace of their world is most clearly felt. And as you imagine it, you might feel yourself breathing more slowly too, the day's thoughts falling away like petals, leaving only calm. Let us linger still longer in the palace, letting time stretch and drift, not just over a single day, but over the quiet turning of seasons, the soft years passing like pages in a book. Life for the concubines was measured not only by bells and lantern light, but by the blooming of flowers, the fall of leaves, and the waxing and waning of the moon. In spring, they would rise early to walk through the damp gardens, listening to the sound of sparrows chattering in the eaves, watching gardeners prune and water the first buds. There was a freshness in the air then, a sense of renewal. They might gather around a stone table in the garden to float poetry slips on water, a playful game where each woman would write a verse and set it drifting downstream, taking turns to read them aloud when the papers came to rest. The laughter that followed was quiet but real, and for a little while the weight of etiquette seemed to lift. Summer brought warm, lazy days when even the palace seemed to move more slowly. Servants hung reed mats over doorways, sprinkling them with cool water to bring a faint breeze. Concubines would sit together fanning themselves, sipping tea with a touch of lotus seed or chrysanthemum, listening to the drone of cicadas. The nights in summer were long and soft, perfect for moon viewing or simply sitting in the courtyard, watching fireflies glow like tiny lanterns among the trees. In autumn, the air grew sharper, and the palace took on a quieter tone. It was a time of contemplation, of writing longer verses, of burning incense made of fallen leaves and sandal wood, the smoke rising in slow, spiraling columns. They might pick chrysanthemums from the gardens and arrange them carefully, each flower carrying meaning resilience, endurance, quiet beauty. The food became richer, the teas warmer, and the moon, gazing during mid-autumn festival, became a highlight of the year. Winter was stillness itself. The snow muffled every sound, and the palace seemed to sleep. The concubines would sit near the brazier, embroidering heavy robes or mending clothing, while outside the pine branches bent under the weight of frost. There might be occasional plum blossom viewing trips, for the sight of a single blooming branch in the snow was thought to bring courage and hope. Over the years, the concubines would see new faces arrive, young women full of shyness and wonder, and older ones leave, either called to serve elsewhere or retiring to a quiet life beyond the palace walls. Friendships deepened, becoming like threads that held them steady. They might give one another small gifts, a hand, painted fan, a hairpin, a scroll with a favorite poem, tokens of quiet companionship. Sometimes there was sorrow. A friend might fall ill, and they would sit by her bedside, whispering poetry to comfort her. Sometimes there was joy, the birth of a prince or princess, celebrated with sweets and music, the palace for once bright with color and song. Through all these moments they cultivated a calm resilience, a kind of inner strength that came from accepting the rhythm of life as it was. This is perhaps the most enduring image of them. Women seated in soft lamplight, speaking in low tones, their hands busy with some small task, their faces serene. Outside, the seasons keep turning as they always do, and the moon keeps rising, silver and patient. If we imagine sitting there, year after year, we might feel how time becomes gentle, how life can become like a long, slow poem, not rushed, not loud, but full of meaning in every quiet gesture. Tonight, as you let this image settle in your mind, you may feel your own breath slowing, your body sinking deeper into rest. There is no hurry to leave this palace. Its walls are high, its gardens wide, its ponds still and reflective. You may stay here as long as you like, listening to the faint rustle of wind through bamboo, the sound of distant bells mocking the night watches, until even those sounds seem to fade into the softest silence. And now, as the long night continues, we come to the last and quietest part of our wandering through this distant, hidden world. Imagine the palace after midnight. The lamps have been turned low, most of the servants are asleep, and only the watchmen move quietly through the courtyards, their wooden clappers sounding softly to mark the hours. The moon may have crossed to the other side of the sky by now, casting pale light over the rooftops, and the air feels even stiller, as though time itself is holding its breath. The concubines are resting now, their day finished. Some sleep alone, some share chambers with close companions, but all are surrounded by silence. Mosquito nets sway gently with their breathing. The faint scent of sandalwood or plum blossoms may still linger from earlier in the evening, mixing with the cool night air that seeps through the windows. This is the time of dreams, when their minds wander beyond the walls that hold them. Perhaps in dreams they return to their childhood homes, to the sound of familiar voices, to the sight of open skies without walls. Perhaps they walk through the palace gardens, but alone and free, without ceremony, touching the leaves, dipping their fingers into the ponds, watching the moonlight dance. In the deepest hours there is nothing to do but rest. And this rest is not merely physical, it is a kind of surrender, a giving up of every duty, every expectation, until they become as still as the sleeping palace around them. When dawn comes again, it will all begin anew. The rising, the washing, the quiet meals, the lessons, the music, the endless waiting and small joys. But for now, we stay with them in this pause between days, this most tender moment of stillness. If we listen carefully, we might almost hear the faint rustle of their breathing, like leaves shifting in the dark. We might almost see the dreams they dream, painted in silver light across the floor. And as we imagine this, we might begin to feel that we are no longer only visitors, that we have become part of this slow, gentle rhythm ourselves. The world outside this palace, our modern world with its noise and rush, can wait. Here, time stretches and folds softly around us. Here, there is only the sound of night, the feel of soft silk, the glow of lanterns fading one by one. And as this vision grows dim, you might let your own eyes grow heavy. You might imagine lying down on a carved wooden bed, the mattress soft, the quilt warm, the net drawn around you like a cocoon. The last thing you see is the moonlight touching the floor. The last thing you hear is a distant bell mocking the hour. And then, slowly, you drift away, as if you too were one of the concubines, resting in the heart of the quiet palace. When morning comes, the gardens will still be there, the birds will still sing, and the slow dance of days will begin again. But for now, you may let go of everything, sink deeply into the stillness and sleep.